president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. Well, let's begin with tariffs. Tariffs are always in the news. This is President Trump's favorite government program, or at least one of his most favorite government programs. We'll begin with what he said. He recently said that anybody who questions tariffs is a fool. He says these are bringing prosperity and greatness to America. Well, I guess he's referring to Ronald Reagan, because remember Reagan in that now famous video said that tariffs are very destructive to a nation, along with trade wars. They impoverish nations. People retaliate for them, and they bankrupt businesses. And of course, this just caused Trump to go ballistic, because the head of the Ontario government in Canada published an advertisement during the World Series featuring what Trump was saying. And Trump went ballistic over this because Reagan was fiercely against tariffs and trade wars, because they are highly destructive. And I think the last thing we would say about Ronald Reagan was that he was a fool. Now, Reagan was not a libertarian by any means. He was a conservative, but clearly he had libertarian orientations, libertarian tendencies, and one of these with respect to free trade. And he was absolutely right. I mean, if you go back to 1776, when Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher, published his great book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, people had lived under mercantilism and government control of economic activity and economic protectionism and this trade deficit nonsense for eons. And they believed, like Trump did, that this is the way you help people. This is the way you cause standards of living to rise, except for the fact that throughout history, people had been mired in poverty. And so along comes Adam Smith and says, well, let me explain to you why people have been mired in poverty for centuries. Because government's intervening in economic activity. That if you just get government out of economic activity, get rid of government helping people with poor laws and anti-speculation laws and anti-profiteering laws and economic protectionism, trade wars, the standard of living people will rise. And it's pretty easy now to recognize the principle as far as free trade goes. I mean, Trump says that a person that advocates free trade is a fool. Well, he's essentially saying that most reputable economists are fools, which is ridiculous, because one of the really fascinating phenomena for me in this whole thing is that the amount of people in the mainstream press and mainstream America that have become advocates of free trade. I mean, that's one of the benefits of what Trump has done. I mean, the number of pro-free trade commentaries and op-eds has just been phenomenal. And it's a very simple principle. That is that when two people enter into a trade, they improve their standard of living just through the trade itself. And the reason is because in a trade, people are giving up something they value less to get something they value more. And both sides are engaged in this. So just through the simple act of trade, people's standard of living rises. And without, industries and manufacturers and other things like that, just trading, people can raise their standard of living. And so when you apply that to millions and millions of people entering into just countless trades every day and every week and every month and every year, you can see how standards of living rise just through free trade. And we can see this domestically too. Notice that we don't have trade restrictions between the states. If Trump's principles in favor of economic protectionism and tariffs and trade wars was the correct one, that it improves people's well-being, why not do it between the states? Each state could have its own trade restrictions and tariffs on goods from other states, and therefore every state, the people of every state, standard of living would be rising. In fact, that was the system under the Articles of Confederation. That was one of the reasons why they went to Philadelphia to ostensibly to modify, reform the Articles of Confederation to stop these trade wars between the states. And so when the Constitution calls into existence this whole new system of a federal government, they made it clear that the states don't have this authority. And it just makes sense that, look at the trade deficit between Virginia and Maryland. Now, the best thing that could ever happen, I'll tell you, one of the best things is just abolish this statistic of the trade deficit. Totally irrelevant. It's just ridiculous. Let's just take the trade deficit between Virginia and, let's say, Florida, because it's further away. And boy, I don't know what it is, but I would, and I doubt anybody does. I don't know if they keep statistics on it. And that's what I'm saying. There shouldn't really be any statistics on trade deficits and so forth. But let's say the Virginians are spending more on Florida, and then Floridians are spending over here, snowbirds going down to Florida and Disney World and so forth. Well, who would be pacing the floors at night, worrying about this trade deficit? Virginia's saying, oh my gosh, we're going to go broke. We're going to go broke. The trade deficit with Florida. We need to balance the trade. Ridiculous. Nobody even thinks about it. Nobody cares. And it's the same thing internationally. And we can apply it too on borders completely. Like Trump's immigration socialism. And that's what the immigration control system is, as I point out in my new book, The Case for Open Borders, a primer, available on Amazon. Very expensive price, $1 for the audio version or the Kindle version. That we have open border between the states, and here in Virginia, anybody from Maryland can come into our state. Hundreds of thousands of people cross the Potomac every day. They can be terrorists, Muslims, drug dealers, illegal immigrants, terrorists. All kinds of dangerous, scary creatures are coming into our states. People are stealing our jobs. People are selling goods to Virginians, and nobody cares. Okay, well, if somebody cares, it's not enough to say, oh my gosh, we've got to have border restrictions. We have to have, immigration control around the state, a wall around the state, and all this. No. It's like nobody's calling for those. Well, there are a few people calling for that type of thing, but it'd be the worst thing that could ever happen. Because then we'd end up with all the same chaos we have along the border, and which is now expanded nationwide. You'd have troops in Virginia cities. You'd have the border patrol. You'd have the wall around Virginia. All the same nonsense that you have in the border, and that is now expanding nationwide. But our ancestors says we're not going to have that kind of system. But the principle's the same. It brings harmony. It brings higher standards of living to people through the division of labor, through trade, and people getting jobs is a trade. So I challenge President Trump's assumption that people who favor economic liberty and free trade are fools. I think he limited it to people who advocate free trade. But the principles of economic liberty are the same as the principles of free trade. So then you've got the Supreme Court that is still going to decide the constitutionality of what's going on. Now keep in mind, and I think Trump's finally coming around to this conclusion. And he used to say, oh, the foreign nation's going to pay this terrorist. We're going to make a lot of money by doing this. No, it's a sales tax, President Trump. That's all it is. I think he's come to that realization that it's Americans who pay that sales tax. It's like when you go into a store and you buy something and you pay a sales tax, or on Amazon, you can see it says sales tax, or any other store that you buy from. I bring up Amazon because it's kind of funny, because Amazon at first said we're going to, their shopping cart, they break it all down. And it is, I think most stores do. But Amazon said we're going to break it down also what the tariff costs, which is a sales tax. It's just an additional tax when you buy something overseas. It's a special tax on buying an overseas product. But it's a sales tax. And so they said we're going to break it down so people can see this. And Trump went ballistic. He didn't want Americans to see what his tariffs were costing him, which kind of indicates that he knows that it's not so foolish to oppose these things. If it was really a good thing, he would say, yeah, show it. I want Americans to see what they're paying here. But so now when you buy something from Amazon that comes in from overseas, it's all hidden within the price because Amazon buckled. And you know, I can understand why they would buckle. If they hadn't buckled, Trump would very likely threaten to do some bad things to them in terms of regulations or taxes or whatever. Just condemning them openly, costing them business. They didn't want that controversy. But here is Trump essentially saying that he's got the authority to raise sales taxes on the American people, willy-nilly. And Congress delegated this authority that said, well, if you declare a national emergency, you'll have this authority. But I think Congress meant a real national emergency. And so Trump says, well, we have a national emergency because we have this trade deficit, which, again, is a ludicrous notion. But so they're before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to decide the constitutionality of this because, I mean, I know people scoff at the notion of dictatorship in America, saying that could never happen, but this is pure dictatorial power. When a ruler of a country can raise taxes on people on his own initiative, willy-nilly, that's dictatorial power. Because Trump says 100% tariff here, it's 100% sales tax on the American people. 30% here, 30% sales tax on the American people. 70% here. Oh, okay, you've been nice, I'll lower it down to 60%. But he's making the call because he says, I've got this national emergency. And, of course, the lawyers in the Supreme Court case, the lawyers in favor of free trade, are saying, that's ridiculous. That's not a national emergency. And I don't know if they're questioning the whole notion of national emergency. I doubt it, but they should. There's no national emergency exception to the exercise of power and the delegation of power in the Constitution. Why? Because the framers understood that emergencies have always been the way that rulers destroy people's freedom. This is how dictators arise. They declare emergencies, or they use emergencies as an excuse to take away people's liberty. And so they didn't have a national emergency exception in the Constitution. But it started growing, like during the Great Depression, where the Supreme Court starts deferring to the executive and saying, oh, well, the Great Depression is a national emergency. Well, yeah, but there's no exception in the Constitution. Oh, well, we have to do this. And so they essentially create amendments to the Constitution judicially without going through the process of amending the Constitution and saying there's now a national emergency exception. And Congress is not supposed to be delegating its powers anyway. Congress should be deciding whether taxes are going to be established and raised or lowered or whatever, not the president. And so that's one of the issues before the Supreme Court. Does the ruler in the United States really have that kind of authority? And of course, you know where I come out. And of course, he doesn't have the authority. That's not what this country was supposed to be all about. We're not supposed to be about dictatorship, whether political dictatorship or military dictatorship or economic dictatorship. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one comes out. Let's segue into the drug war, because it's part and parcel of all this. The drug war killings continue in the Caribbean and the Pacific there, where the military is attacking people in these boats that are supposedly transporting drugs. It's just a massacre. I mean, it's horrific. I mean, I can understand the military needing some picker-uppers, after the 20-year war in Afghanistan, undeclared war, going into that country, destroying the whole country, killing countless people, and then getting defeated. It's a war, really, that there has not been much soul-searching here in the United States about. There needs to be some soul-searching. I mean, what was it all about? What were the consequences? What are the ramifications? But it's like gone. It's like, let's not talk about that. And immediately now they have these conquests, military victories. I mean, it's really bizarre. I imagine they're going to be passing out badges like for combat, like the combat infantry badge. They don't have infantry here, but they have the Navy battles against these boats. I imagine they're going to be getting medals on their uniforms and stuff for participating in the Caribbean battle against these boat people. I mean, this is really bizarre. This is just a massacre. And some of the families are now speaking up of the victims, that saying, my father or my husband was just, fisherman. He just needed some extra money, or one guy lost his job. And these are little people. I mean, I've been saying this for weeks about this thing. They're not the drug kingpins. What is Trump thinking? Does he really think he's going to make a dent in the drug war? The drug war's been going on for decades. They've been killing drug cartel leaders. You go back to Pablo Escobar in the 70s and 80s. Go see Narcos, the series Narcos on Netflix, as well as Narcos Mexico. And you'll see what I'm talking about. They've been going after the kingpins, not the little the boat people here. And all to no avail. They knock out one drug kingpin, that he's replaced by 10 more. This is what a black market's all about. So you've got this drug prohibition black market that they then use as the excuse to engage in these boat killings. They use their own black market that their racket produces as the excuse to kill people or to invade countries. And of course the question arises, why doesn't Venezuela or Colombia or Mexico have the prerogative of setting its own drug policy? If they don't want to enforce drug prohibition, they're an independent nation. Why do they have to follow U.S. drug laws and U.S. drug prohibition? In fact, Trump's now thinking about pivoting to Mexico after having brought this big armada into the Caribbean. My hunch is that he thought he was going to pressure Maduro into leaving office there in Venezuela. And it may well have been a bluff. Hard to tell at this point, but as I said from the very beginning, Trump has wittingly or unwittingly put himself into a trap. Because now what does he do? If he withdraws those troops, that big armada, you know what Maduro's going to say, that he faced down the coward Trump, that Trump was all, bluff. But if he attacks Venezuela, now I think it's going to be an easy victory. Venezuela has been under sanctions for decades. They have a very weak military, I'll guarantee you. And I don't see those troops sacrificing themselves against the U.S. military, the most powerful military in history, despite the fact that it got defeated in Afghanistan and got defeated in Vietnam and so forth. It's still going to be much more powerful. Will they cause more damage than these attacks on the boat people? Well, yeah, I would imagine so. They may kill a few soldiers that are invading or whatever, but the result is not in question. Maduro is going to be taken prisoner, or he's going to be executed or assassinated. They've already got the CIA operating inside there. So if Trump goes in with an invasion, my hunch is that Maduro is going to end up dead or brought back to Washington in chains and paraded down the streets, just like what used to go on in the old Roman Empire when they would conquer recalcitrant people within the empire. But now he's talking about pivoting to Mexico. Well, President Sheinbaum there is, trying to walk this fine line of, she knows that if she uses the military to really crack down, you're talking about massive violence. We've learned this. If there's anything we've learned in this whole drug war racket is the more you crack down, the worse things get. Because you knock out one cartel, you're always going to get new ones to replace it. That's what a black market does. We saw this with alcohol prohibition, Al Capone and so forth. The only way you can get rid of these gangs is through drug legalization. Just end the prohibition. That's what Sheinbaum ought to do. It's what Maduro ought to do. It's what Petro and Colombia ought to do. What they all ought to do is just legalize drugs in their countries. Immediately, the cartels would go out of business because now reputable companies would be selling drugs. Now, there would be illicit drug smugglers into the United States because they would still have the drug war racket. But that would be the U.S. problem. Now, we all know that Trump would go ballistic, tariff, 100% tariffs, 1,000% tariffs on these countries. But if Mexico ever wants to restore the way it was before, like when I was a kid, where people could travel in Mexico freely, it was a beautiful country, didn't worry about violence and drug war, kidnappings and assassinations and so forth, you got to just legalize drugs. Unfortunately, Sheinbaum's not there yet, just like every other president of Mexico hasn't been there. I think Vicente Fox brought it up once after he was president, I think. But that's really the ultimate solution to this whole process. And, of course, Trump would go ballistic, the DEA would go ballistic, the Pentagon would go ballistic. But the fact is, every country's got a right or a prerogative to set its own drug policy. And that's the drug policy that Mexico and the rest of them ought to follow. Now, we've seen over time that as they knock out one cartel, it's replaced by the other. I mean, we saw this with Pablo Escobar in Colombia. Yeah, I've long recommended, if you haven't seen it, go see the series on Netflix called Narcos, and then the subsequent series, Narcos Mexico. And it shows you what I'm talking about. Back then, the whole obsession was Pablo Escobar. And Escobar was the big drug kingpin of the day. I mean, he was making hundreds of millions of dollars, killing people. I mean, the massacres that he engaged in are just mind-blowing. But the whole idea is, if we get Escobar, man, we've made a dent, or we can end the drug war. We won the drug war, and they ultimately found this guy and killed him. Didn't make any difference. His cartel was immediately replaced by his competitors. And you see federal judges today. I mean, it's so weird to see this, because federal judges, you would think, are pretty much a smart group of people, and yet they're repeating the same diatribes when they sentence drug people to long sentences that were being said by federal judges back in the 60s and 70s. I grew up in South Texas, and I practiced law there. I handled drug cases, and I remember the federal judges coming out, declaiming against these drug dealers, and I'm going to give you the maximum sentence, and they'd give them the maximum sentence. Like, for what? What does it accomplish? Because now the federal judges today, maybe they don't realize that they're just repeating the same stuff. And the DEA agents today are repeating the same lines when they have these record drug busts that the DEA agents were saying back in the 70s. And those agents, of course, are retired or dead. They're living off their fat pensions, and they got this new generation that are saying the same things. It's the same with the Border Patrol. I grew up there in Laredo with the Border Patrol, and all those guys are dead or retired. My best friend in high school, his father was head of the Border Patrol office there in Laredo, and he's long since deceased. But the Border Patrol here is they're just saying and doing the same things that were done back when I was a kid growing up there on the border, and nobody stops to think about, what are we doing? What are we doing? And that's why I don't blame Donald Trump. I mean, Trump is operating within these systems, and he knows how to use these systems to his maximum advantage. That's what's fascinating to me. He's a smart guy, and he knows how to consolidate power. He knows the importance of consolidating power in the military in order to maintain control. You got to have the military. When you have a national security state, you got to have that national security state on your side. Kennedy learned that, man. Kennedy went to war against the national security state, and look where he ended up. Trump knows that in order to have power, total power here, he's got to have that national security state. But he knows how to use these other systems, the immigration control system, the drug war system. He's using this drug war racket to its maximum extent, bringing in the military, okay? Because he knows the Supreme Court won't jack with the military. Ever since the Kennedy assassination, the Supreme Court has never touched the national security establishment. And so I don't focus in on Trump as such, as many liberals do. I focus in on the systems, and this is what I try to do here at the Future of Freedom Foundation, and what we've done for 36 years here is raise people's vision to the wrongfulness of the systems that 20th century Americans brought into existence. The welfare state system, the national security state system, the immigration control system, the tariff system, the trade war system, the drug war system, the public school system, the paper money system, the central bank system, the regulated managed economy system. These systems are the problem, not Donald Trump. And this is why Americans, I say, need to do some real soul searching here, is that, do you want to continue under these systems? These are not our founding systems. If you go back to my favorite period of time, 1870 to around 1900, none of these systems existed. And this was the in my conviction, the freest period ever. Now, statists were making inroads. They had Jim Crow laws coming into existence. They had the Spanish-American War that they brought. They had the Chinese Exclusion Act. They had the Sherman Antitrust Act. So statists were making inroads. But when you look at this way of life, 30 years, like one tiny beacon of liberty throughout world history, with none of these systems that I just mentioned. Income tax system, that's another one. It's a phenomenal period. It shows you that libertarianism is not utopian. It's perfectly capable of being achieved, and then we build on it. Like I say, it wasn't a perfect libertarian panacea, women's rights and so forth, but it's a system where we can build on it, and it's possible to achieve. And so that's why we keep emphasizing the wrongfulness of these systems as compared to focusing on, oh, well, if we just got a new president, Kamala Harris or Newsom or whatever, everything would be hunky-dory. It wouldn't be hunky-dory, because then they would be exercising these same powers that Trump is exercising. So to achieve the genuinely free society, we've got to be talking about achieving a society of economic liberty, political liberty, civil liberties, which is what our current series on civil liberties is all about. All aspects of liberty. They come together: educational liberty, healthcare liberty, and so forth. Now we're talking about a genuinely free society. That's Trump Watch for this week. Thank you all very much for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of the Future of Freedom Foundation. We're very, very honored and very, very grateful. I look forward to seeing you all next week.